Okay, that's great. I reckon we're starting a little bit late anyway. That was my fault. Do you think we should just crack on, inshallah, and people will probably drop in as they're ready? I'll pop a reminder on the group now, inshallah. I'm going to just mute everybody else because otherwise we'll end up with background noise. Give me 1 second. Oh. And if you could just unmute yourself. Okay.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا بما ينفعنا وزدنا علما يقربنا منك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا وأصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك اللهم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, the topic for today was about medical fatwas, giving of medical fatwas. And it's going to be just based around an article that I wrote some years back. And it didn't get published, but because I wrote the article for Muslims, mainly for Muslim doctors and for fuqaha, ulama. I wrote the articles meant to be for them to give advice on giving a fatwa, especially regarding fatwas to do with medical issues. And so after I wrote the article, it was presented to a gathering in America of Muslim physicians or something. And it was a Dr. Asim Padella. I'm not sure if you guys have come across him, from America. Dr. Asim Padella is someone who's quite into what they call Islamic bioethics. Anyway, he got me to sort of write it, and then it was presented at that. I was meant to go to America, but at the last minute I found out it was quite difficult to get a visa. Anyway, I didn't go, but it was read out there. And then he wanted me to get it published into a book, a chapter that he was writing a book on Muslim Islamic bioethics. But it never got into the book, I think, because I'd written it for a Muslim audience, as I said, for fuqaha and for Muslim doctors, and to get into a sort of academic book, it had to go through a lot of revisions and edits, and I was asked to make a lot of changes. And in the end, I just got fed up and gave up, because I just didn't want to put in the time to get that done, because that wasn't my intention in the first place. But anyway, so the article is the basis of the circle today, and I'm going to share it with you guys. So I'm sorry I haven't put it onto PowerPoints, but I'm just going to literally scroll down the article, but I'll just explain it in my own words rather than reading it from the actual paper, because that would be too boring. So inshallah. As usual, feel free to interrupt at any time, to make any comments or ask any questions. And very happy if anyone wants to do that as we're going through it. So this is the article. You can probably see it on the screen, inshallah. And this was an edit. This was about the fourth edit that was done by Asim Padella. As I say, there's a lot of chopped and changed. So the title that I had used was about giving medical fatwas and Islamicization of modern biomedicine. But he changed the title to Nature, Creation and Islamicization and Enhanced Biomedical Imaginary for Muslim Clinicians and Jurists. So I honestly have got no idea what that means. But I think it probably sounds good anyway. But anyway, as I said, my articles actually was meant to be sort of some guidelines or some thinking points, really, more than guidelines, some thinking points for Muslim doctors and especially for fuqaha and ulama who have to give medical fatwas and how they can go about that process. So I'm just going to talk through the main sections of the paper. As I say, I won't read it because that would be too boring, but I'll just try to explain it in my own words. So I started with the paper. I'm still planning to put it out there for publicly for the ulama actually, but I haven't got around to it either, because we went through this process of trying to make it sort of acceptable to Western academia, and then in the end I gave up, and then I need to actually still review it and make it more focused towards the ulama again and put it out there for guidance for ulama. Anyway, I started off by saying that just when we're giving fatwa, a fatwa, I'm sure you all realize, is a Islamic legal ruling. So very, very basically, a fatwa is basically halal or haram. Is something halal or haram? Why do you have to give fatwa? Because often many issues are not directly dealt with by the Quran or the Sunnah. So therefore, you need a mufti, an Islamic scholar who has got a very wide and deep knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah to give a fatwa on a new issue that has arisen. People probably don't realize that over 90% of issues are new. They're not directly dealt with in the Quran or the Sunnah. Where you see people saying, we should go back to the Quran and the Sunnah, it's a little bit misleading, because 90% of fiqh, or probably 95% of fiqh, Islamic law, Sharia, is stuff that is not, because if you think about it, so many things can happen. And the Quran and the Hadith are, they're very limited in that sense. Obviously, the Quran says that Tibyan and likulli shay. The Quran describes itself as Tibyan and likulli shay. The Quran is a clarification or an explanation of everything, kulli shay. So the answers are there in the Quran, but they have to be derived. They have to be, ijtihad has to be done, a type of reflection, deep reflection on the sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. Anyway, so to give a fatwa on a medical issue, the mufti must consult a medical expert if the mufti does not have that prerequisite knowledge of the field. So for most medical issues, the mufti or the alim, he's not going to be a qualified doctor. So in that case, they would have to consult a medical expert to give the fatwa. A good example of this recently was obviously the COVID pandemic. With the COVID situation, if you remember back in the early days, there was a lot of issues that came up that needed rapid fatwa. Do we close the masjids? What do we do about the burial? What do we do about the janaza? Are we allowed to not to wash the body of the dead person? Obviously, in the early days, people had a lot of confusion about whether COVID can be transmitted on from the dead body, etc. Can we close the masajid? When should we close the masajid? So there was a process there that took place where certain ulama were consulting doctors to get, and I think that was a good illustration of where sometimes, you know, the Mufti also needs guidance there, because the Mufti doesn't really know the field. So in some cases, in many cases, they were consulting the wrong people and they didn't realize. So for example, ICU consultants or, you know, emergency consultants were being consulted, whereas really you should have gone to an epidemiologist or so, you know, so things like that. But because the Mufti doesn't know, he just thinks a doctor is a doctor. So that's an example of where you also not just go to, you can't just go to a medical expert, you need to go to the right medical expert as well for the issue that you're looking into. That's something that came out from the COVID thing. So the Muslim scholars, they were going to ITU consultants, and obviously they were just telling them, look, you know, this thing is killing people. People are coming in, they need oxygen, but it wasn't really helpful in the sense that what the muftis really needed to know was epidemiological or you know, facts about how the virus is spreading and things like that. Anyway, the other thing is when the Islamic mufti goes to the doctor, the medical doctor or the medical expert, also the mufti needs to realize that this medical expert is coming from a certain modern biomedical perspective. So a lot of the themes in this paper are things that we've already talked about in the previous circles in this series. So in a way, it's like a type of review or a revision of stuff that we've already talked about. And so we probably can go through it quite quickly, inshallah. As you will see, most of the things we've already touched on in different talks. So it almost sort of like brings it together in this particular lecture. So we've already talked about, you know, the modern biomedical perspective and how that may be in conflict with the Quranic worldview. So that's something that needs to be bear in mind. Otherwise, the Mufti may just accept the medical expert's view without realizing that they may be based on a certain worldview, a modern sort of scientific worldview that may be in conflict with the Quranic worldview. So then I talked about certain areas of modern biomedicine that may be in need of Islamicization. So I use the term Islamicization rather than Islamization, which has become quite popular. I feel that the term Islamization is not, doesn't really, if you look at the etymology of it, to me, doesn't really make sense how you can make something Islam. You can make something Islamic. So I tend to use the term Islamicization, which some people use rather than Islamization. Most of the things that I talked about in this paper are themes that we have already discussed in previous circles. So first of all, when we talk about Western biomedicine, we now obviously mean something that is globalized, but by Western, we just mean where it originated from. It is now global medicine, biomedicine. And I talked about how it's a scientific system based on empirical data derived from repeated observations and experimentation. And sort of Western biomedicine came about in opposition to what they called at that time quackery. In America, especially in the sort of Wild West, you had all these quacks that used to wander around selling dubious herbs and things for people, making a lot of money. Interestingly, the sort of the founder of the first biomedical school was John Rockefeller, can't remember his D or if that's the one currently. The original John Rockefeller, who made his money from oil. He was the first oil baron. And he became the richest man in America in the, I believe it was the late 18th century or mid 18th century. And he's the one who founded the first sort of biomedical school, the first medical school. And his father was a quack. His father was one of these people that used to go around making, he was basically a con man. He used to wander around the Wild West, selling very dubious, herbs. But he was a con man. He wasn't even a genuine herbalist or anything. So Rockefeller then, set up this medical school. So one of the things I argue in this paper is that by doing this, what actually happened was you lost a vast amount of traditional, what we call traditional medicine, Islamic, Chinese, herbal medicine in general, which was actually based on thousands of years of accumulated wisdom in how different herbs and different things can be used to treat ailments, physical ailments. So there must have been a lot of good also that was lost when sort of modern biomedicine took over. The other point I made was that the fact that biomedicine is scientific is actually the whole scientific culture in the West derives from Islamic civilization. It's increasingly being recognized now that modern scientific method originated in the Islamic world, in the medieval Islamic world. And the reference I gave here was not the best reference in the world because it's just but I didn't have time to really dig up better references. But you have Jim al-Khalili. Jim al-Khalili, I'm sure you've seen, he's like a physicist that has a lot of TV programs on BBC and stuff. He did a series called, I think it was called Islam and Science or something on the BBC. Anyway, he talks a lot about how, he talks about more like the Arab world because he's a Christian Arab, but it was clearly very much an Islamic thing, not just an Arab thing. How the Muslims developed scientific method, which then later on seeped into Europe. So in a way, the point I was making here was, in that way, the fact that biomedicine is a scientific discipline has got nothing, that doesn't oppose an Islamic worldview. If anything, it comes from an Islamic worldview. So a scientific system of medicine is very compatible with an Islamic worldview. In fact, it can be convincingly argued that medieval Muslim physicians were the pioneers in this direction. I'm sure you know about the medieval Muslim physicians that were doing anatomy of the human body, dissecting the eye, doing advanced eye surgery, and all that stuff was being done hundreds of years ago in the Muslim world. There was a really nice story, actually. I haven't got it in this, but we mention it in my history course that I run in parallel. A really nice story about some Muslim scholars that were writing. Sorry, did you want to say something, Sophia? I think you're unmuted.
No, sorry, I didn't realize I was not muted.
Oh, no problem. There was a really nice story, but I don't have it handy. But it was written by Muslim scholars at the time of the Crusades. So when some of these Western Europeans were coming into the Muslim world around the Mediterranean in the Crusades, obviously they were coming into contact with the Muslim world, and some scholars, because our scholars were always writing history, they were always writing biographies. It was a very, very big science in the Muslim world, the writing and study of history. So they were writing about some of these crusaders and some of their customs. And one of the things they wrote about was their very, very primitive, backward type of approach to medicine, and how, described how there was an ill person and how these Western Europeans had tried to treat the person using these really, really silly things, and actually had ended up killing the person. And they were contrasting it with the Muslim physicians of the time and the remedies that they had prescribed, which were very sort of rational and scientific. So there's no doubt that the Europeans had a lot of contact with Muslim world during the Crusades, in Islamic Spain, in Sicily, and with the Ottomans. So all of this had a massive influence in Europe. Anyway, however, the Western worldview or Western philosophy then later took a different direction, which diverted from an Islamic worldview, which was in the 19th and 20th century, especially, where Western Europeans really, in terms of their philosophy and worldview, they went into an atheistic direction, and they no longer believed in any type of metaphysical realm. And finally, in the 20th century, Western philosophy ends up in basically this thing between relativism and positivism. Positivism being that we believe in science and mathematics. We believe in observable facts, empirical facts and mathematics. That's positivism. And relativism, which was basically saying even science and mathematics, all of it's relative. There's no absolute truth to be found in anything whatsoever, not even in science and mathematics. And so that's where the West has ended up in terms of philosophical reality. So here, where I was arguing that the Muslims never went to that direction. Even the Muslim philosophers, they always believed in God. The Muslim philosophers, they never were atheists. So that does have a massive impact on our worldview. If you believe in God, if you believe in Akhirah, then that's very different to the Western philosophical basis of science. Then I talked about biological reductionism and determinism. And this is something that we need to question as Muslim medics and Muslim scientists. When we look at the Quran, so reductionism, if you take it to its logical conclusion, leaves no place for human volition, free will, conscious free will. We've talked about that also in the past. I mentioned here that free will is precisely what makes us human, according to Imam al-Ghazali. So the actual, and this is, as medics, as scientists, we we often are indoctrinated in ways we don't realize. But if you take that reductionism to its, that everything ultimately goes down to the firing of neurons and the movement of molecules within neurons within the brain, that's essentially what they're saying is a reality of the human being. But this has a major difference because as Muslims, we believe in the soul, the eternal soul, the ruh. This is completely denied in the biomedical model. And so this has massive ramifications. Okay. Even when we talk about psychiatry and psychology, which are dealing with health beyond the physical, most psychiatrists or psychologists, are still working on that assumption that everything, the mind, the psyche, everything goes back to the physical brain and ultimately can be broken down into the neurological transmissions and things like that. Even Freud, for example, who talked about dreams and unconscious realities and things like that, he believed that everything ultimately would be explainable in the physical structure of the brain. So I think we talked about some of those themes before. So Islamicizing biomedicine would involve this trying to map out the relationship between the soul and the body, especially as this impacts on health. So here we can draw on the writings of Muslim scholars and physicians such as Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Balkhi, and many others. We talked last time about Imam Al-Ghazali's writings about the human heart. By human heart, he actually means soul. Often, even to today, many Muslims are confused about what is heart, qalb. Why? Because the Quran talks about the qalb. But it's very important to realize we're not talking about the physical heart when we're talking about the qalb. We're talking about the spiritual heart, which is basically another word for the soul. Yeah. So when we say the heart, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the heart many times. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تعمل أبصار وتعمل القلوب التي في الصدور. That it is not the eyes that are blind, but it is the hearts that are blind, that are in the chest. The Quran says that literally, it is the hearts that are blind, not the eyes. So what it's talking about is a spiritual blindness, It's a spiritual blindness, not the physical blindness. A physical blind person may be a very strong mu'min, may be a strong believer. In fact, in our history, we have many blind scholars and great awliya, people who are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saints. I don't really like the term saint personally, but it's more of a Christian term, but for want of a better term, in the Islamic tradition, we have great people who are blind. Imam al-Haddad, for example, and from the early period, also great ulama of the Salaf that were blind. So clearly the Quran is not talking about, when it's talking about blindness, it's not, summun, bukmun, umyun, deaf, dumb, and blind. It's not talking about a physical blindness, it's talking about the spiritual blindness. And that particular ayah of the Quran makes it very clear, La ta'mal absar, it's not the eyes that are blind, but it is the qulub, which are in the chest, which are blind. So this is talking about a spiritual blindness. So the spiritual heart is not the physical heart. The spiritual heart, I'm just going on about this because I know till today, many Muslims I talk to, I'm talking about educated Muslims and so on. They're still very confused about these things. It's the spiritual heart, the soul. Now, as Imam al-Ghazali points out, the spiritual heart is connected to the physical heart when we are in our physical bodies. Yeah, so when we are in our physical body in this world, there is a connection between the spiritual heart or the ruh and the physical heart. And that connection is very subtle. And Imam al-Ghazali says it's a type of connection that we can't really rationally comprehend. And so it's one of those things not really worth going into too deeply, but it's similar to the way you could say it's a vessel. The physical heart is a vessel for the spiritual heart, but the spiritual heart also extends to every part of the body. The ruh, it's based in the physical heart, but it also spreads to every part of the body, a bit like the nervous system, or even a bit like the blood system. So, they penetrate to every single cell of the body. So that's what we mean by spiritual heart. So this relationship between the soul and the body is key to the Islamicization of biomedicine. So really, I think this work of Islamicization of modern biomedicine has not really been done. And part of the reason why it's not being done is, can you imagine the amount of the person who specializes in this field? There would have to be someone who has a medical degree, a modern medical degree. There would have to be someone who has an alim degree, and on top of that, there would have to be someone who's then read a lot of these classical works by Ghazali, Ibn Sina, and the great Muslim physicians and thinkers. So that's a huge task for anyone to take on. Also, on top of that, as I argue later in the paper, this person would also have to have a degree in traditional medicine, like hikmah, what they call hikmah nowadays. So you still have hakims, and there are still some colleges in the Muslim world where you can study to be a hakim. So the person would have to have all of that. And that's why I don't think there's anyone out there, or if there are, they're very, very few that have managed to bring together all of those fields of learning. Then I talked about the idea of progress. Once again, a theme that we've already talked about before. The idea of progress is very, very central to the Western worldview. It's so deeply embedded that a lot of us have taken that assumption on as well without realizing it. That progress is something we don't question, at all. It's just taken for granted. This is like one of the really, really core assumptions. And I was quite happy to find recently a book by someone called Ahmed Keeler. I don't know if you guys have come across him or this book. So Ahmed Keeler is a British Muslim, one of the community of British Muslim converts, I believe, who's based in Cambridge, and he's written a book which talks about this idea of progress, the Western idea of progress, and he talks about the Islamic concept of balance. And he says basically in Islam, in the Islamic worldview, we have no concept of progress. In the Islamic worldview, we have balance. In the Quranic worldview, we have balance. And the Western worldview, we have progress. And his whole book is on that theme. So I really recommend that if people want to look into that further. But I was glad I was looking at that book, and it was very much in line with some of the stuff that I was talking about in previous classes. And it's also something I talk about in the Islamic history course in depth, more in depth. Because remember when we talked about, for example, animal experimentation, and how I suggested that it was completely against Islam to experiment on animals, which involves any type of torture or pain to the animal, of course. If it's harmless, then that's fair enough. Just like we experiment on humans by doing, we experiment on humans when we do clinical trials and things, but they're very, very tightly controlled to try to minimize any harm. So but if you're going to treat animals with disrespect and completely torture them, then I think that's completely wrong. And then some of you, I think, mentioned, well, how are we going to make any progress? How are we going to make scientific advancements, etc., or medical advancement? Which is a valid question, but what I'm arguing is that it's based on this assumption of progress and scientific advancement that is almost now taken for granted around the world. Related to this idea of progress is the idea of biological evolution, which Darwin came up with in 1859, or some say he didn't come up with it, but he popularized it. In any case, he's considered, the main person behind it. So these are quite closely linked, evolution and progress. We've talked about this before as well, so I won't go into it too much. But Darwinism or evolution became so entrenched in Western worldview that it almost replaced religion. And then it was extended into so many fields beyond its original application. So sociologists and anthropologists talk about social Darwinism, for example. Social Darwinism, where you're taking the ideas of evolution, survival of the fittest, etc., and you apply them to human societies. And this also helped to justify theories of racial superiority, especially in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, before the whole idea of racism became taboo at the end of the Second World War. Most people forget now, but Adolf Hitler was nothing unusual in Europe. The whole of Europe were completely racist, exactly like Adolf Hitler. Churchill was just as racist as Adolf Hitler. The only mistake that Hitler made was that he turned the racism towards the European Jews, which is something that the Europeans had not done before. The westernized European Jews had been incorporated within the white race. So then I talked a bit about evolution of species, and I said, evolution of species, I don't feel that it's necessarily un-Islamic, in the sense that we could argue that there was a type of divinely guided evolutionary process. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being through this process of evolution of species. It would give us however, this would result in us believing that the parents of Adam were some sort of almost human ape-like creatures. That's what that would imply. And that, I would argue, is probably intuitively doesn't really line up with our concept of the human being. However, for my personal opinion is evolution of species is neither here nor there. What's more important is that if we're going to argue that there was a divinely guided evolution, this is very different to the biomedical or the scientific, which believes in random mutations. So according to our Aqidah, our theology, there's no such thing as a random event in the universe. everything is predestined. So therefore, we wouldn't accept that part of it. Any questions or comments? I'm saying quite a lot of stuff. I don't know if people have anything to say at this point.
No, exactly. I think that's really interesting, and I think I also feel similarly in terms of the evolution thing. I think that, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam. You know, we've honored the children of Adam. So Adam alayhi salam cannot be something less than a human being. And we talk quite specifically about the creation of the human race, and the importance it's given in the Quran, and the description to the angels being taught the names, etc., being taught, you know, that would have this will and this rebellion. And, you know, so actually, I think it's kind of the conclusion I've personally reached as well. And I think in terms of sort of the rest of the animal kingdom, I think the difference is that in this sort of this reductionist approach, or, you know, as you've described it before, I mean, we're basically an extension of the animal kingdom, aren't we? In the Western worldview, whereas the Quranic worldview distinguishes us from beasts, you know, and from animals, and from creatures that have no intellect, or creations that have no intellect and aren't able to form judgment, and that we are, you know, vicegerents on earth. So very, very different position from the way that we're viewed. So, and then, as you say, you know, it's all part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine plan. And I hadn't actually thought about the random mutations, but you're absolutely right. We don't see them as random. We will see what if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this. This is his way. This is his method, or his system, or his divine plan. I don't see a conflict with that. But yeah, Jazakallah khair for explaining it so clearly.
Anyone have any questions? No? Okay. So then I think I went on to talk a bit more about evolution and ahsani taqweem. We talked about in the past, in previous classes, how Allah's created mankind in the best stature. So if a human being is created in the best form, ahsani taqweem, that means something which is best cannot be made better. So according to evolution, or the biological evolution theory, you'd expect humans to continue to evolve. Yeah. So that's another argument that I have against the idea that thing can continue to improve. And then also the notion of man being a constant struggle. This is quite linked to evolution, survival of the fittest, etc. It also goes back to Hobbes, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, talked about how, you know, societies had developed from the primitive, uncivilized human, savage human, almost, he called it the savage, and how over time, slowly, you know, human societies also evolve. And once again, the pinnacle of that was the white man, the modern white man, who had become the rational, democratic, etc., etc. So we reject that whole idea, you know, that there's nothing to say that primitive, so-called primitive people are savage or uncivilized. You know, if you look at those that were considered primitive, like Native Americans or Aborigines in Australia, they're not savage. You know, they live in very civilized meaning very, you know, cooperative societies. They look after each other, they cooperate, they share. You know, so the whole thing is just silly, really. But it was all linked to the whole idea of the white man being the pinnacle of evolution. This is obviously, as I said before, World War II, when racism has now become taboo. But these were the widely spread notions before that. Yeah, Sania?
Sorry, I just wanted to say that also some of these primitive communities actually have some of the best life expectancies in the world and best health in the world. They're untouched by doctors.
Mhm.
They're not medicated, and actually they have a very simple lifestyle, simple food, eating less and working hard. And we're often presented as this idea that, you know, modern is the, you know, and I think it comes back to your concept of progress, really, that, you know, this is what's best, but it's not always what's coming to you that's best. Sometimes, in fact, you know, I've got an interest in lifestyle medicine. It's a big move to going back to exploring things like the Hajj community and various communities where people have traditionally lived to over 100 years. And I know that even in my family, I know certain grandparents that lived, mashallah, to a ripe old age, and great grandparents lived over 100 years, and they were having a bit of ghee and a bit of roti and a bit of, you know, quite a simple lifestyle, but they weren't eating processed foods. And, you know, they didn't have social isolation, and they didn't have dementia, and they didn't have a lot of this other stuff. I was always taught, well, people in, you know, South Asian countries, poor people, third world, they die at 42. And maybe they do, but actually people that were still living a very basic, non-processed, you know, whatever kind of lifestyle. Obviously there's infectious disease and other things, but actually had quite a good quality of life and enjoyed good health. So I think this notion that actually we're always better off, you know, it's partly this, you know, obviously we're encouraged to explore less kind of science, and in some ways I do think progress is an important thing, because we should be exploring and learning and understanding, but with humility, and knowing that new things might have pros and cons, you know, that we don't fully understand. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about was to just explore the concept of social evolution. If you could explain that in a bit more detail, and what that looks like and how it affects us, please.
I think once again it was, you know, prior to World War II, it was, it had become just a way of, you know, just what I'm talking about here, really, that societies have evolved over centuries and even thousands of years. And this idea that you go from like the primitive savage, so those Aboriginal type people, then you go to sort of settled agricultural, you know, then you've got the hunter gatherers, and you've got the settled agriculturalists, and then finally you get to the modern, you know, industrial age, scientific revolution, etc. So it was all linked into a type of evolutionary framework. You can even see that remnants of that now still in some biological textbooks, you know, where you have this picture of the ape, and then you end up with a white man standing up, and somehow the color goes from black to white as well. So that was what I think they meant by social evolution.
Exactly. I think that's yeah, that's still very much true. And I think that you know, it's still portrayed that way, isn't it? I think you know, I think racism is a very deeply rooted thing. I think it goes back since the creation of man, even Fir'aun, and, you know, his prejudice towards the Israelites. I mean, basically it's rejection of another race, isn't it? Or, I mean, we see it now in terms of skin color, and I think that's coming back to Darwin, but there's always been something about arrogance and disliking other people that seems to be deeply rooted. Jazakallah khair.
So yeah, so then, you know, obviously this whole idea of this struggle against the environment, the human being is in a constant struggle with the environment, all of these enemies, viruses, superbugs, etc. The human creature should be protected. So all of that seems to go against some of the ideas of what the Quran is telling us, that Allah has subjugated for us all that is in the heavens and the earth. So I quoted some of the verses of the Quran here, ayahs of the Quran. Have you not seen that Allah has subjugated for you that which is in the heavens and the earth, and has bestowed on you his favors outwardly and inwardly? So many ayahs of that nature indicate that somehow, as you said, the human being is the Khalifa, the vicegerent. So everything is subjugated for the human being, created for the human being. It seems to be quite different to this idea of the constant struggle and the battle against the environment and all of these enemies out there. And once again, when we look at traditional modes of medicine, they often talk about the harmony and the balance with the environment. So that's some of the things that need to be, looked into. I know, one of the things that modern medicine prides itself is that it's sort of recognized all these bugs, bacteria, viruses causing illnesses, etc. I know that some traditional modes of like homeopaths, for example, they don't really follow that model of infections. I'm not saying either way. I honestly don't have the knowledge of traditional medicine or homeopathy to make those judgments. But all I'm saying is there's work that needs to be done there, looked into more deeply, because as doctors, we know that many of these bugs that are supposed to cause these infections and things are already there in your body all the time. So it's definitely not, is it necessary or sufficient cause? Yeah, there may be necessary but not sufficient cause. So we have those bugs already, the ones that cause pneumonia or whatever. But for some reason, at some point, they start then, when you become ill, obviously we see those bugs multiplying and then we give them antibiotics. But as you know, and as I know, these bugs are usually already there. So what is it that makes them actually activate or whatever? Things like that we need to think about. When as doctors, when we're talking to lay people, we just simplify it. We say, oh yeah, you've got an infection. You got infected by so-and-so bacteria or so-and-so virus, but really we're not being completely honest, are we? There's something more going on there. Anyone want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think there are two things actually. One is the body's natural defenses being run down. So that would come in terms of lifestyle and stress and other things that we know deplete the immune system, high quantities of sugar. I mean, there could be lots and lots of reasons. And the other is sort of meddling with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. So for example, with the coronavirus, I don't think without picking on, any particular race or country, and who knows what the truth of it was, but let's assume it was people eating bats or things that not really meant to be doing, or there were some conspiracy theories around biomedical weapons and things. I'm not saying that's the truth, but the point I'm trying to make is meddling with Allah's creation, creating things. So for example, with air pollution and asthma, I mean, that's a direct byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. So there are many things where we meddle with nature and we perhaps create new diseases. So I think that's something to be aware of. And our bodies aren't programmed. So artificial sweeteners and the impact that they have on obesity, you still get obese, you still get, and in fact, your body's then trying to clear out toxins. And so I think there are two aspects of this, really.
Yeah. Noor?
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair. No, I had a question around, I think fits in nicely with Sania's point just now. In terms of, from what you said and your background in anthropology, one of the positions that, a biomedical model takes, and is obviously in terms of biases and, using a model to have evidence base behind any particular therapeutic intervention. Now, obviously, that doesn't come with its own problems with the pharmacology and pharmaceutical industry, but that arbiter and the importance of having a rational arbitration, and just a point made by Sani in terms of consuming bats or other cultures and other cultural or folk practices, and even when you take the Muslim lens, there still has to be some sort of a rational lens added onto that, and it can't just be, someone says cow urine is a treatment and we just accept it because that's what they want. So I'm just wondering if from what you said, there's still a huge value in terms of a rational position and utilizing sort of models of logic and models of evidence base and putting some importance on that.
Yeah, I didn't quite get the question, or sorry.
No, sorry, it's a bit long-winded, but no, I think from what you said, and my impression is that, we can criticize biomedical medicine, but at the same time, obviously, there is huge value in it because there's an approach to arbitrate between different proposed interventions, if that makes a bit more sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm by no means criticizing biomedicine. I do make that point in the article as well. In fact, there's huge advances that have taken place, which we know about, but it's about looking at, when we look at it from an Islamic or a Quranic worldview, the sort of subtle things that may need tweaking or Islamicizing, as we said, and thinking about, for sure. I think personally, the advances in surgery are phenomenal, all types of surgery, and that's something very much that the Muslims were doing, because that's more of it's not really, I mean, what is surgery? It's sort of like plumbing, it's like fixing things, you can't, if something's wrong, you can cut it out or stitch it up, and that's very, very amazing, the sort of surgery that's being, and also life-saving stuff, we can save lives in ways that were never possible before, like emergency life-saving stuff is really advanced, Noor, I don't know if you've got your hand up again or if that was a previous hand.
I'll bring it down, thank you.
Noor, do you want to say something else, or Sonia, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that's an important point made by Nora's. I think my reflection on it is that, so the way that medicine's moving now, we talked about progress, and I think I mentioned this before, but if you look at a lifestyle approach to medicine, which is now becoming more and more mainstream within the Royal College of GPs, that's all about balance. So you talk about balancing, diet, nutrition, sleep, exercise, stress, social connection, and even spirituality is recognized as giving you purpose and better health outcomes. So I think that balance is something that's traditionally lacked in medical education, but I think there is a movement towards recognizing that, which I think reconciles very well with the Islamic model, actually. I think the other aspect of it is that I think it is important to avoid quackery and to make sure you're not exploiting people and their trust, because we're in a position of trust. That means that we should act on the best available knowledge that we have. I think the problem that we have with, some of what you're saying, not what you're saying, but what you're explaining in terms of modern medicine, why it needs Islamicization, is to do with arrogance. And I think that it's thinking that this science is God. I mean, I have a patient at the moment who has devoted his entire life to science, and he moved to this country for science. His world is the lab. I mean, he's an oncology lab, and that is his whole world. But the problem, but for us, we understand that all knowledge is limited, and that is basically, we have to have that degree of humility and know that actually the unknowns are more than the knowns. What we have is a drop in the ocean. I think when we have that, we to a degree, we start to reconcile some of these areas. And I think that's the bit that's missing. And yes, I know that, that there may not necessarily be a concept of soul in the way that we know it in terms of Western medicine. But I think when we as practitioners and doctors recognize that we're dealing with a human being and not with a machine, and that the outcome is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands, and that actually we're acting in trust on the best available knowledge that we have, that's been based on sound information. We've used our aql, which I think is very important, and that I think is a direct Islamic concept to use your aql, use your intellect, read the science that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. I think that's what this whole model of sort of trials and where it becomes quite important to make sure that we're acting in an evidence-based manner. But I think remembering that there are still so many unknowns, and that we only have part of the picture. We only see, in NLP, we say the map is not the territory. So you get part of the map, not the whole picture.
Yes. Jazakallah. Shuja? Shuja, did you got your raised hand? Might need to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not sure if that, maybe that's a mistake. Jazakallah khair, thank you, Sister Sania. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so yeah, you're right. I think it is. They do seem to be definitely recognizing, going back to this idea of balance and things like that. And
sorry, I was having difficulty in unmuting myself.
Oh, no problem.
I was very interested. I'm sorry I joined late, but I was very much interested in Sania's and Nur's comments. I think science is actually now proving back what we've been told. If you look at processed food, for example, as Sania said, the whole emphasis now, even in the medical world, in terms of lifestyle changes and all that, is all what we've told wholesome food is what we should have. And the bacterial and infections, actually, it's a balance between the good and the bad bugs, if you like, and the good bugs are being destroyed by even in one's own body. And people have not learned very much in the past, but I think they're now learning now and realizing the effect of, the impact of the normal flora that one has. And so I think there's a lot of things that in the past people used to one is now said, one regards now as modern medicine or modern lifestyle is being shown to have its drawbacks. And I think there's a lot to be learned now from what modern science itself is showing about how good life was in the past. And many of the things are being confirmed by the Quranic teachings as well. I mean, if you just take fasting and intermittent fasting as an example, and the diet, and it's amazing how many of the things that are in the Quranic versions are actually being confirmed by science and by scientists.
Jazakallah khair. Very good point. Yeah. Noor, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess again, further to my previous point, in terms of obviously a lot of medicine is on the extremes. So I know, forgive me, some of the well-being medicine is obviously to be credited, and lifestyle changes are important, but quite often I think sometimes you're making decisions in extreme situations with extreme patient positions. So if I just use the sort of the Bolam test as an example, obviously certain interventions obviously can be very life-changing, and in that sense, with the Bolam test, obviously they've adapted the Bolam test to have a rational body of doctors. So it can't be just a subgroup of doctors with particular views. So this is a test that would be applied to physicians and their choice of interventions and so forth. But so again, I guess probably I'm just making my own thoughts around the importance of still recognizing that not to over medicalize the world experience, but at the same time, quite often, and working in medicine, we do see very, very often the extreme positions and the extreme experiences of people.
Yeah, good point. Anyway, let me continue to scroll down a bit. We talked about traditional medicine, balance, and so on. Then I went on to the perfect creation principle, which I talked about in previous thing as well, about how science, the whole concept of science is to enhance or improve nature. Improve on nature. Whereas we don't believe that nature can be improved upon. It's a perfect creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can use science to enhance, to make, I'm not saying we can't use science, but it's a very, very fundamental assumption or belief that science can improve on nature. And I suggest that we reject that from a Quranic worldview, because, for example, the Quran says in Surah Al-Mulk, I've quoted an ayah here, no want of proportion will you see in the creation of God the most gracious. So turn your vision again, see you any flaw. Again, turn your vision a second time, your vision will come back to you dull and discomforted. In other words, you will find no flaw in the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's almost like a rational necessity. If we believe in God and believe in a perfect creation, we can't suggest that this can be improved in any way. So I think, like some of you were saying, people are now realizing, they're going back to like raw milk or whole foods and things like that. Whereas there was in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of things, powder milk is better than breast milk and all that stuff. But people are realizing that the nature is best. In other words, what Allah has created is best. So whenever we hear the thing, oh, natural is best, what really we're saying is what Allah has created is the best, and people are recognizing this more and more. Now, when I said science can enhance, because remember there's that famous hadith about the palm trees. Yeah, the famous hadith about the palm trees where the Prophet ﷺ saw some people who were cross-pollinating the palm trees by hand. And he said, what are they doing? He was from Mecca, he wasn't a farmer, he didn't know about, So these people were people who in Medina, they used to have a lot of palm orchards, date palms. And he said, what are they doing? And they said, well, they're just, they're using their hands to cross-pollinate. And the Prophet ﷺ said, better if they don't do that. In other words, he was saying, leave it to nature, how Allah's created it. Allah's created it to happen naturally. Leave it to natural. Very interesting, because then what happened? The farmers, they stopped doing that, but then the crop was much worse. The date palm crop was significantly reduced. And when the Prophet ﷺ found out that they've stopped doing that and the crop has become much worse, he said to them, no, do what you were doing before. And he mentioned that this was his own thoughts and he was not speaking based on revelation. And he said to them, you know better of your worldly affairs. So this is a really interesting hadith. It is a strong hadith. If it wasn't a strong hadith, you would really, it's in the Muslim, you would really question whether you can rely upon it, but it's a strong hadith. So it gives us some idea that we are allowed to, human beings are allowed to intervene to enhance things in nature. However, it's also interesting that the Prophet ﷺ instinctively felt that you should leave it to nature. So that was also another part of the hadith which we can reflect upon. Then I talked about some medical practices that from an Islamic point of view would have been picked up. And we had a previous class on this, so I'm not going to go through them again. Remember previously we talked about appendix and appendicectomies. For many years, surgeons were just cutting out the appendix when they were doing other operations because it was believed to be a vestigial organ. I don't know if they're still doing that, but it was something that they were doing when I was in medical school anyway. And my argument was that if we had been looking from a Quranic perspective, we would have never done that as a Muslim surgeon, because we would have realized that this is the perfect creation of Allah. And there's no such thing as a vestigial organ. There's an organ that has no function. And we would have, just based on our worldview, we would have, even though we didn't scientifically know the role of the appendix, we would have assumed that the appendix is something useful. The other example was about the formula milk for babies. You know, in the 1960s and 70s, basically mothers were put under a massive pressure not to breastfeed because you were being bad to your baby by not giving them the formula milk. And so many mothers actually stopped breastfeeding. But then by the 70s, doctors had started to realize that breast is better. And then there was a whole campaign going the other way, and mothers were told to breastfeed again. So once again, Muslim physicians should have known already that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the breast milk. It's going to be the best for the baby. It's not something we should have waited for science to tell us. And then the example of raw milk as well. The Quran talks about how Allah has created for you milk from these cattle. Just from that ayah of Quran, it should have been clear to Muslims that that raw milk is going to be something pure and good for you. But, you know, so etc., etc. So these are all examples of, you know, if we as Muslim physicians, Muslim scholars are looking at things from our own Islamic perspective, we wouldn't have fallen into some of these traps of so-called scientific advancement. But then scientific findings are also changing all the time. I guess another example is the butter margarine thing now. I'm sure some of you GPs were telling people not to have butter, go to margarine, and now you're telling them to go back to butter again. But we should have known that the butter is something that is natural. In other words, something that Allah has created. Scientists are coming along telling us they've found something better, artificial, but that's not the case. And then I went on to look at some actual fatwas. So a fatwa that has been published in the UK to do with hormonal contraception. So I don't know if some of you have come across this, but he's actually someone who's a friend of, well, not a friend, but a colleague of mine. Muhammad ibn Adam al-Kawthari. I think he's from Leicester. He was a well-known mufti in the UK. He's written a book on hormonal contraception, basically saying that it is permissible in Islam to take the hormonal pill as contraception. And my argument in this paper, and I was not making this as a fatwa, I just want to make that clear as well, but I felt that it was worth raising some issues here with this fatwa, because I'm sure that Muhammad ibn Adam al-Kawthari, he's not a doctor, so he definitely would have consulted Muslim doctors. And he was obviously given advice by these Muslim doctors of how the hormonal contraceptive pill works. And based on that, he has issued a fatwa that it is permissible. And I feel there that, you know, there's issues that may not have been taken into consideration. We're looking at things from the Quranic worldview once again, as a human being is a creature that is created in perfect perfect form and balance. But the neuroendocrine system, as I'm sure you guys realize, is part of a very complex system within the human being. And there's a very subtle balance between all of these neuroendocrine substances or factors or hormones. And they have impact on multiple systems, obviously on nearly all systems within the body, organs within the body. So to look at, I mean, I don't know who advised him, you know, which doctors he has spoken to, but I'm suspecting that they've given him a very simplistic explanation of the hormonal. They've said to him something like, I don't know, estrogen causes the release of the egg. If you have the pill, you increase the hormone levels and then the ovulation does not occur or whatever, something like that, or implantation does not occur because the uterus is not ready to receive it. But they haven't given him that wider picture of how the human body works, the balance, all of the other effects that those hormones have within the body, and so on. So I think by taking the hormonal contraceptive pill, which is something that the woman will be taking every single day, apart from certain few days of the month, is, in my view, is messing with the creation of Allah, or the perfect creation and balance that Allah has put within us. And this can have ramifications on multiple organs within the human body. I mean, even if you don't look at it from an Islamic point of view, just the point of view of the complexity. Remember, we talked about complexity theory in the past, which is very much now being recognized slowly, that biological systems are complex systems. So if you tinker with one part of the system, it can have very effects throughout the whole system that are unpredictable. Even from that point of view, I would say it's highly suspicious. So that's what I've tried to explain in these couple of paragraphs here. A perfect balance, if we apply our perfect creation principle, the menstrual cycle being part of the whole body system, and so on. And I said, for the sake of being provocative, let's call it messing with the perfect creation of Allah in the form of hormonal contraception. So yeah, I'm sure you guys have some views on that. So welcome to open that up. Anyone has any views on that, contraception? Or?
I think it's a very difficult area. And I think even in Western medicine, when we prescribe contraception, it's supposedly done on a risk balance benefit. So we have to follow certain charts to look at, you know, what, whether the woman is put at risk over benefit. And I think the other aspect of what you're describing is, I think, and I'm no scholar, is whether we are looking at best practice versus permissibility, which I think are two different things. What would you do ideally versus what is halal? Just like, you know, you have halal and tayyib, you know, the best standard is halal and tayyib, but there are many things we know that are not tayyib that are halal. So it's about, when you're dealing with the mass population, you've got to look at the full spectrum of what's available and then make an individual decision based on that, you know, on that purpose. I also get the argument that you're describing that, you know, we are tampering with Allah's system. And there are things that we've discovered, obviously, for example, with a combined hormonal contraceptive, you know, risk of DVTs and, you know, other things that we do see. And also the risk with almost any hormonal contraception of low mood and depression in women that's often not picked up and not identified. But I think at the same time, it's, you know, I think, as I said, I think it's an individual thing, and I think it is a risk balance kind of thing, in terms of how it affects the individual, and having an open mind to these side effects and having that discussion and seeing what that contraception means for somebody. If somebody's life is, you know, obviously this now has a system, but there are people who, you know, for example, for whatever reason, they want to space their children out, and perhaps that becomes a hardship. We don't have that infrastructure necessarily of extended family support, or weakness, or, you know, you've had a cesarean or whatever it is. There are very valid reasons for being able to space out your children, if not to raise them properly. Then I think that we have to look at what the best way is for this, and that I think is going to be different for different people. That's my perspective anyway. I don't think contraception should be outlawed. I don't think it's haram, but I think it, you know, it's, you know, I think it's on a risk balance kind of scale. And I think, you know, in an ideal world, yes, I think we do look at, you know, we shouldn't tamper with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, but then you could say that any modern medicine is tampering with Allah's creation. But I guess the difference here is whether we are tampering with Allah's creation over lifestyle choice, rather than seeking healing. And I think that might be where the balance is tipping.
Yeah, Jazakallah. I mean, obviously contraception is definitely permitted, no question about that. And don't get me wrong, I know people, many Muslims who use hormonal contraception, including scholars, wife of scholars. So it's definitely something a little bit controversial that I've brought up here, but this is my own opinion. I just feel other forms of contraception should be used, not the hormonal thing. But yeah, as I say, I'm not actually giving a fatwa here, because giving a fatwa is a very, very big responsibility. So I'm just really, this was just once again for Muslim muftis and also medical doctors, because you guys, I mean, scholars are going to come to you to get your expertise. So just to consider, you know, don't give simplistic answers to the fuqaha, because they need to also, they won't, because then they won't understand these more complex issues that are involved. So yeah, it's I mean, it's not criticism of any doctors or anything, but it's the fatwa itself, you know, because a Muslim, when they're looking at contraception, they want to, there's different options of contraception, and the hormonal pill is one of them. And obviously the Muslims want to ask the question, is it permissible? And if they were told it's not permissible, then they would look at other alternatives, I guess. So that's really what I'm focusing on. Then another thing that we've talked about in the past, so we won't go into it again, but about animal experimentation. As you probably realize by now, I feel quite strongly about this. And I really feel that it goes right into the depths of modern science, which is, obviously medicine is a part of modern science. But a lot of modern science and medicine is built upon cruelty to animals, torturing animals, especially now with genetics. I mean, the big breakthroughs now are going to be in genetics. And the sort of experiments that are being done on animals with genetic is just horrific. It's just beyond what you can imagine, what these animals are going through. And I just want to pick up actually what you said, Sania, about these animals being not having intelligence, because this is a very widespread belief amongst people, you know, the idea of the dumb animal. And this helps to justify a lot of the cruelty that is being done to animals, because they're seen as dumb and they don't have the intelligence of human beings, etc. I really want to question this massively. I initially thought about this based on, once again, the Quranic, you know, when you read the Quran, what does the Quran say about animals? It actually, when it does talk about animals, like Sulaiman alayhi salam, he was taught the language of animals. He could understand what the animals are saying. Now, how do we understand that? There's only two possibilities. One is that animals do communicate with each other but we do not understand that. And Suleiman was given understanding of that. Or the other possibility is that animals don't normally communicate, but it was just a miracle for Suleiman that the animals were able to communicate in front of him. I think the first one is the more likely explanation. And that what makes more sense is that animals do communicate. And however, we don't know, we don't understand their communication. And Sulaiman alayhi salam was given and was able to understand their communication. So
contemporary fatwas and problems.
So I think if you look at the communication of the animals in the Quran, like the hudhud bird, it's communicating in a very intelligible way. It's speaking sentences and things like that. Now, so based on that, I always thought there's maybe something here that modern scientists or biologists haven't really understood, you know? And I've done a bit of reading on that recently. In the last decade or so, there's been massive advancements in studying animal communication. So there was a book I was listening to actually recently called Animal Societies. I forget the author. But anyway, he was presenting some of the latest findings, scientific findings based on observing animals and studying animal communication. And they're finding that animals are communicating at a very high level. They're calling it intelligence. They're finding now that, for example, whales, they have names for each other. It's really, anyway, so it's a big diversion. I don't want to go into it right now. But the point is, you know, even rats, you know, they find that rats have, basically they look after each other. If you have a rat that is cold and hungry and you have another rat that is in a dry, it will actually open the door and let the other rat in to have some comfort. And it's interesting because the guy who was writing the book, he's talking about all this advanced level communication, and these they seem to be showing these emotions like compassion for each other and things like that. But he, you know, because he's so in that sort of biomedical reductionist model, he keeps sort of saying cautiously, like, we should be cautious here. We shouldn't assume that they have got emotions like we have. But you know, what he's describing is so obviously that they have emotions and they have communication, intelligent communication. I'll give you another example from the book. When you look at elephants, I mean, it's just phenomenal. So elephants, they live in a very, very organized community. They know each other, they speak to each other all the time. But one of the fascinating things I found was that when one of the elephant dies, especially if it's the matriarch of the sort of tribe, they, you know, they basically take it to a certain place, the dead body, and then you have all the elephants standing around, and they're standing in silence. You know, so the author is saying it's like they're basically showing respect to the dead. You know, and they stop talking, they're silent, they stand there for a long time. And then even more amazingly than that, they, you know, after they go off, a few days later, they will all come back and gather around that dead elephant again, do the same thing. So it's almost like, very much like human behavior. There's respect for the dead. They're showing sadness that this elephant has died, and so on and so forth. And so the book is just full of, it talks, starting from insects, going up to all of these different animals. And when you get to things like chimpanzees, for example, etc., I mean, you know, they're just showing very, very human-like emotions, compassion, sadness, jealousy, revenge. I mean, when you're looking at chimpanzees, they bear grudges for years and years and years. They have friendships, you know. If someone does something to your friend, the person he will actually take revenge for his friend. He will bear that grudge for many, many years, etc., etc. So I think, this idea of dumb animals is really, even though, that these biologists are still sticking to that, and they're still saying, well, we've got to be really cautious. It seems like they have these feelings, they have these, but, and it's interesting, they often use evolution to try to explain everything. So evolution is such a powerful theory because you can literally use it to explain anything and everything. And conversely, it's silly as well, because the same way, I'll give you an example, if you find some animals, or say human beings, that are monogamous, they only have one partner. There are many animals that will only have one partner, sexual partner, throughout their whole life, and they'll stick to that one. You can use evolution to give an explanation for that by saying, in some way, having that one partner for your life means that your children will have better survival rates, let's say, for example. But then if you find an animal that is polygamous, that has more than one sexual partner, you can also use evolution to explain that. So evolution theory is really, I think, problematic in that sense. It's a bit like jinn, as some Muslim, they can use jinn to explain anything and everything, because everything that happens, you can find some explanation for it. So I think, so a lot of these observations that this biologist is coming with in this book, Animal Societies, he's then being very cautious and saying, we shouldn't assume that they have emotions or they have these things. It's probably just an evolutionary behavior, that has got some evolutionary benefit and so on. So this thing about dumb animal is deeply also embedded within Western science. And it's also, the Muslims got this from Aristotle, I believe, because you see this in the classical Muslim works, that they say the human being, the definition of the human being is al-hayawan al-natiq. This is in the books of logic and theology and Muslim Islamic philosophy. The definition of human being is hayawan natiq, the intelligent animal or the speaking animal. In other words, other animals do not speak, they do not have language, or they do not have intelligence. But I think that was taken from the Greeks, and it's not necessarily true, I believe. And I think latest biological findings are actually showing that animals have a lot of that stuff. The Prophet ﷺ was extreme kindness towards animals. He prevented the Sahaba from burning ants, as we said last time. And now we know that ants have a very sophisticated communities, and they have a type of intelligence that is unexplainable in a reductionist way. So they're starting to call it hive intelligence, because if you look at an individual ant, there's no way that it could have the intelligent behavior that you observe in the actual ant colony. So they've called it hive intelligence, but that doesn't really explain anything. That doesn't explain how it works. And it's just a term that they're using, but there's no sort of scientific explanation for it. I see we've come to the end of our time, so I'm just going to rush through to the end, inshallah. The next section was on the political economy. I think Brother Noor has already touched on that. But I said, once again, when we're giving any fatwa in any branch of medicine, we have to take into account the political economy. So things like big pharmaceutical companies, etc., etc. You all know about the sort of biases that can come in, because it is massive business. Funding is a massive thing. Whenever you do any sort of, you talked about evidence-based, but to get the evidence-based, you need a lot of funding. Clinical trials, they need a lot of funding. They need a lot of cooperation from many, many clinicians around the world or around the country. You need large numbers of participants to make it viable. So this type of funding comes with strings attached, or so on and so forth. So any serious mufti or fatwa panel would need to take such subtle things into account. Now, one of the ways you can do this is when you have to give a medical fatwa, you form a fatwa panel. So you have your mufti, you have your medical expert. As we said before, you've got to get the right medical expert. And then also you can have people who have studied political economy. So these are the medical anthropologists, which possibly could come in here as well, because the field of medical anthropology is focused on, one of the main focus is on the political economy, the effect of big pharmaceutical companies on biomedicine and so on. So my suggestion was that for any medical fatwa, there should be a fatwa panel which has got representative from the medical expert, the legal expert, the anthropological expert, and also the homeopathic or traditional medical expert as well. And that was it, inshallah. I'm going to leave it there because we've gone through a lot of time. Inshallah, hopefully that was give some food for thought and was of some interest, and hopefully challenge some of you guys as well. So inshallah, I'll leave it there. Happy for any further comments or questions before we finish.
Right, does anybody else have any questions? I think there's one message on the chat. Oh, somebody had to leave early. Okay, that's fine. Does anybody else have any questions? I know we've overrun a little bit tonight. I think we've made it quite interactive.
Yeah, that's fine. Alhamdulillah. Good.
That was really interesting. Lots of food for thought and lots of diverse topics today. And I've certainly learned a lot. Jazakallah khair as always, and keeping us spiritually and professionally and ethically interested. I think it's so important. Jazakallah khair. So I'll leave it to you to conclude, Sheikh, inshallah, and then we can upload the video recording for people.
Jazallahu anna Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jazallahu anna Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jazallahu anna Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Amin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Sorry, okay, 1 second. Let's just leave it. It's fine.